present For the Record.
Just ahead, another candidate throws his hat into the Madison mayoral ring.
I've always strived to make the city better. In every job I've had, I try to improve things as much as possible.
And new documents shed more light on Senator Ron Johnson's role in a slate of alternate electors in Wisconsin.
I'm Tony Evers, and yes, I am jazzed as hell to be sworn in again as a 46th governor of the great state of Wisconsin.
Plus, a roundup of a big week at the state capitol. Welcome back to For the Record after our 2-week holiday hiatus, and a Happy New Year. I'm Naomi Coles. This week marks not just the 2-year anniversary of the January 6th insurrection at the U.S. Capitol 2 years ago, it also marks the wrap-up of work by the Congressional Committee investigating what happened that day. Troves of new documents released this week continue to expand the nuanced picture of how lawmakers were involved, giving us lots of new insight into especially one Wisconsin lawmaker in particular. UW-Madison journalism professor Mike Wagner joins me to break it all down. Thanks for coming on.
It's my pleasure.
So I want to talk about Senator Ron Johnson. So in short, we learned this week that he had a bit more involvement earlier on in this alternate slate of electors that ultimately got signed by 10 Republican electors, attempted to send to Congress. And all along, we've heard from him that he didn't have knowledge of this, even though his office was at times involved. So this week we learned he was actually pushing the legislature early on, before December 14th meeting, to back a slate of electors. What does this tell us about this picture? What ramifications should we expect?
Well, it certainly calls into question his public statements about all of this since the beginning of the time. Reporters have asked him about this. He clearly has been involved in pursuing a path to potentially overturn the results of the 2020 election in a way that the person who didn't win would then become the president. And so the former state Republican Party chair testified to this, to the January 6th committee, that he was, being pressured by the senator to do this. And so Senator Johnson has some things to answer for. Normally, he falls back on claims of media bias or claims of an incomplete context or confusion. But these are things that he clearly didn't seem to be confused about at all, and should tell the voters and citizens of Wisconsin about why he did what he did.
And we did ask him, his office this week, about, what these new texts say. And his statement to us was, A, he didn't recall the conversation that he allegedly had with then party chair Andrew Hitt. He also said this doesn't change his stance all along. He has always backed the legislature having more involvement in selecting electors. So where does that leave us? Not remembering the conversation, but also what would change the picture if the legislature actually could select their own electors after an election like this?
Well, to answer the last part first, it would mean that the votes of the people of the state don't really matter. It would mean that whoever the legislature decides to empower would be the people who choose, which is a way to think about how elections should be conducted in the United States. It's not a particularly democratic one, or not one that most people, including myself, would support, but it is an idea that the voters shouldn't matter and that the legislature should get to pick. That is a particularly dangerous road, I think, to go down, especially given what happened on January 6th at the U.S. Capitol.
How close are we potentially to that road? Do we know of other states potentially giving this idea of the legislature having more involvement a closer look?
Many states that are controlled by Republican legislatures are pursuing a variety of legal remedies to think about how elections are counted, how they're interpreted, how election results are then communicated to the U.S. Congress for the purpose of certification. And so this is something we need to be paying attention to. The Klein Center at the University of Illinois called January 6th an attempted coup. Like, that's a serious charge made by a group that basically studies terrorists and despots around the world, saying this kind of thing happened here. And a U.S. senator from our state was one of the people who were pushing an alternative slate of electors to subvert the will of the people.
So let's pull back big picture once again, kind of return to the work of the January 6th committee. We know that they've now actually recommended charges. What's your take of whether that actually happens?
It's very difficult to know. The Attorney General, Merrick Garland, doesn't really tip his hand on this very much. And I think my reading of the tea leaves may be better than no one else's, but my read of the tea leaves is that they've been very buttoned up which is the kind of behavior you would expect if charges were going to be coming. If they weren't going to charge, you might expect them to leak, well, it's going to be hard to win the case, or the evidence just isn't there, or there are other things that we know that the committee didn't talk about, but those things aren't being leaked at all, which suggests there may be a methodical case being put together, whether that's for President Trump or John Eastman, one of his attorneys, or for Rudy Giuliani, one of his other attorneys. It's hard to know, or for all of them. But it appears as though DOJ is working toward charges of some kind.
So if that were to happen, if charges were to happen from this work of the committee, just put that in historical context of how unprecedented that might be.
I think that would be unprecedented in American history to say that a former president was charged with trying to subvert the results of an election that they lost. And you know, if there were charges, and then, you know, a whole nother step of then if he were to be found guilty of those charges, that would, of course, would then put in jeopardy his ability to seek the presidency again, which he is now trying to do.
Any other takeaways from the work of the January 6th committee that we should be aware of that would be pertinent to mention here?
It was a methodical and public process. It was on television. There were Republicans on the committee, not Republicans who represent the mainstream views of the Republican Party, which is something that the Republican Party has made noise about. But people, lawmakers, elected officials of both parties put together a methodical case that talked about how close the United States came to the death of the vice president and potentially Speaker of the House, and the potential overturning of an election to install someone in office who hadn't won. Those are incredible things, and we just sort of treat it as, oh, that's what happened on Wednesday. But it's really important for us to remember that this happened, and it's the kind of thing that we do not want to happen again in our country.
Professor, thank you as always for your insight. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Absolutely. So when we come back, join our political reporter, Will Keneally, and I, as we break down a big week at the Wisconsin Capitol.